Sunrise. Biblical Teaching with Leslie Thomas.
Welcome back to the second episode of my podcast, in which we're looking at the objections that have been raised to the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. We looked at 3 last time, and today we will look at several more.
The oldest attempt to discredit the resurrection is the suggestion that the disciples stole the body of Jesus and then spread about the hoax that Jesus had risen from the dead. And this goes all the way back to day 1. It's recounted in the New Testament itself. Matthew tells us that the elders bribed the soldiers guarding the tomb to say, "Tell the people his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep." It's Matthew chapter 28 and verse 13. Hey, but there's several problems with this theory. And they're centered around the security that was mounted at the tomb. Matthew tells us that a large stone was rolled against the entrance of the tomb. In Mark 16, it says that the stone was very large. In fact, the Greek throws this at us, conveying the idea that this stone was so big that it caused a sharp intake of breath from anyone seeing the tomb. Wow, that's a big stone they put over that entrance. That's the plain implication of how the Greek is structured there. Normal burial practice was to roll a slab of stone down a sloping groove cut in the ground outside the tomb until it came to rest across the entrance where it was pegged securely into place. The stone was normally 4 to 6 feet in diameter and 2 to 3 inches thick. And think about that. That would weigh about 2 tons, depending on what type of stone was used. So it's hardly surprising that the women were worried about who would help them get into the tomb. And it certainly dismisses any idea that Jesus, having just been crucified, managed to roll the stone away from the inside and get out. So Jesus' body was entombed, and then this huge stone was rolled against the entrance. But after that, it says that a troop of guards was stationed at the tomb. You see, the Jewish leaders went to Pilate saying, when that deceiver was still alive, he said that in 3 days his grave would be empty. And we think it's necessary to make it secure, or his latest deception will be worse than the first. Now it's interesting that Pilate's response was, "A guard you have. Now go and make it as secure as you know how." And I've just translated that literally from the Greek, conserving the order of words in the Greek. I believe that Pilate, with those words, dispatched a squad of Roman troops to guard the tomb. Some argue that it was the temple police. But after the resurrection, we're told that the Jewish authorities bribed the guards to say that they were asleep. I doubt that they'd have bribed their own employees. They'd have probably threatened them with death. And frankly, how desperate were they to concoct a story that the guards fell asleep? Soldiers just don't make a habit of doing that kind of thing. It's just not believable. And the Jewish leaders told the guards that if the governor heard about it, they'd fix it with him. And that can only be relevant to Roman soldiers, not to temple police. And so the evidence indicates that what Pilate gave them here was almost certainly what was called a Roman custodian, which was a 16-man elite security unit of a type whose existence is very well documented. The very fact that after the resurrection, some of the guards remained at the tomb, while others chased off into the city to report to the high priest that they had a problem, confirms that there wasn't just one guy sat there hoping that nothing was going to happen. But even then, we haven't finished with the security measures that were taken at the tomb, because it says they put a seal on the tomb. The Roman seal could only be put on in the presence of a Roman guard. And at its center was a large wodge of clay in which the troops stamped the imperial Roman insignia. And the significance of this seal wasn't that it was an additional safety device. It wasn't going to prevent anybody from getting in physically. Rather, it was like a modern police line saying, "Do not cross." The seal represented the power and the might of the Roman Empire. And it was a terrible thing to break this seal, because a broken seal immediately initiated a search for the culprit who, when found, would be publicly crucified upside down, so that all could see the severity with which discipline was administered by the Roman Empire against those who affronted it. Such was the security set by the Romans at the behest of the Jewish authorities. And yet it all counted for nothing. Something happened. And so there's another fact that we have to address. The fact that on the first Easter Sunday, the tomb was found empty. In the original Greek of the Gospels, there's something strikingly unusual about the removal of the stone. Each Gospel writer picks it up in his own way, but they all reinforce each other. Firstly, the Greek says that the stone was moved some distance away from the tomb. Then a second word signifies that it was rolled up an incline, but not just the slot, not just the groove, but it was rolled up entirely away from the burial place. And then in his gospel, John uses a word that actually means to pick up and carry away. Now, do you catch the peculiarity of this? If you or I or the disciples or a grave robber or anyone else was going to steal a body, none of those words would be used to describe what would happen. We'd roll the stone away from the entrance as little as possible to get in and out as quickly as possible so as not to be seen. We weren't interested in carting a great lump of rock halfway across Jerusalem. Okay, let's move on. Every one of the players in this drama admitted that the tomb was empty. The disciples, the Roman guards, and the Jewish authorities. In fact, extra-biblical Jewish and Roman sources agree that the tomb was empty, ranging from Josephus, who was by no means a friend of Christians, to a 5th century Jewish compilation called the Toledoth Jeshu. Dr. Paul Meyer calls this positive evidence from a hostile source, which is the strongest kind of historical evidence. In essence, this means that if a source admits a fact decidedly not in its favor, then that fact is genuine. It's interesting that Gamaliel advised the Sanhedrin that they bear in mind, when castigating the disciples, that the rise of the sect of the Nazarene could well be God's doing. Think that through. That could never, ever have happened if the tomb was not empty, or if the Jewish authorities, the Sanhedrin, knew the whereabouts of Jesus' body. Another scholar, Paul Althaus, wrote that the claim that Jesus was raised from the dead could not have been maintained in Jerusalem for a single day, for a single hour, if the emptiness of the tomb had not been established as a fact for all concerned. Paul Meyer again writes, if all the evidence is weighed carefully and fairly, it is indeed justifiable, according to the canons of historical research, to conclude that the sepulchre of Joseph of Arimathea, in which Jesus was buried, was actually empty on the morning of the first Easter. And no shred of evidence has yet been discovered in literary sources, epigraphy, or archaeology that would disprove this statement. The resurrection of Jesus took place in what we call space-time history. It took place 2,000 years ago in recordable history. We know the place, we know the year, we know the day. It was the third day after his crucifixion at Passover on April the 3rd, AD 33. It was the 6th hour. And if we'd been at his tomb and had had a watch, we could have recorded the precise moment. We'd have been waiting at a literal, physical, stone-blocked and Roman-sealed tomb. There would have been other real-life human beings there too. But hold on to that, because many critics say that the resurrection is not historical fact or truth. It's simply some kind of other dimensional spiritual occurrence that has spiritual value for us, but didn't really take place in real history. Let's be clear that it really physically happened, and not be taken in by the lie that 2,000 years ago people were primitive and believed all kinds of superstitious myths and fables. That is just modern arrogance. Another fact relating to the tomb now surfaces. The fact of the undisturbed grave clothes. When Jesus was led in the tomb, in accordance with Jewish burial custom, his body was wrapped in a linen cloth. So actually, in a slavishly literal sense, the tomb wasn't actually empty. The grave clothes were there. When John stooped in to peer into the grave from outside to the place where Jesus' body had been laid, what he saw was the grave clothes. Almost like the empty chrysalis of a cocoon, but now collapsed. They were undisturbed, lying in exactly the place where Jesus' body had been, but they'd not been unwrapped, they'd not been unraveled. And actually, looking on the internet to try to find a graphic for this was so difficult, because every picture I came across from Christian sources represented it as though Jesus had got up and taken this off and slung it down on the bed. It wasn't like that. They were undisturbed in the place where his body had lain. Then, as John's account continues, Peter pushed past John and ventured into the tomb, as only Peter would, and he saw something else that made him realize that an extraordinary event had happened here. He saw more than the linen cloth that Joseph and Nicodemus had used to wrap the body. And incidentally, that's another little confirmatory factor. Wrapping the body was to be done by two people. They had to swathe the body head to foot in cloth, and then were to smear the wrapped body in spices and ointments to help mask the smell of decay. Now, quite probably because it was late on the Friday, they were approaching the Sabbath when they buried Jesus. The men had no time to apply the spices. And we know that the women went away with spices to prepare them and came back with them on the Sunday. So Peter pushed on in. He saw the empty shroud, but he also saw the headcloth rolled up in a place by itself. Now, that could simply mean that it was just an inch or two away. In other words, a head's distance away from a body separated by a neck. Or, more likely, in a different place completely that wasn't visible from outside the tomb and therefore not visible to John's glance. But whichever way, nobody stealing the body would take the trouble or have the time to roll up the face cloth and set it carefully aside, let alone unwrap the body from the shroud. This, for me, is just one of those telltale eyewitness clues that gives the gospel account such a ring of truth. But actually, it's the next factor that I personally find the most convincing argument supporting the truth of the resurrection. The fact that the disciples were discouraged and disheartened. These people were totally devastated by Jesus' death. The man that they'd followed around Israel for 3 years, whom they believed would be the next ruler of the nation, had just been crucified. They'd expected a Messiah who'd be a king like David, bringing justice, but also military and political deliverance. They weren't expecting him to be branded a criminal who'd be convicted and then killed in the most humiliating way. I'm sure that they all felt that they'd just wasted 3 years of their lives and had made very public fools of themselves. No doubt they looked back wistfully on the amazing times that they'd shared. But actually, they still had almost no understanding of what it had all been about. When Jesus was arrested in Gethsemane, his disciples scattered. And a little later, Peter even denied ever having known him. They were ready to return to their former lives because they knew it was all over. In fact, they were deeply concerned for their own safety because as the followers of an insurrectionist, they could easily be the next ones to be rounded up and executed. I've already said that it's widely agreed by scholars that the tomb was empty, the body was gone. But what was the explanation? I've already said that the earliest and most persistent answer is that it was stolen, but that does not fit the facts. Neither the Jews nor the Romans would have gained anything by that. And in any case, if they had stolen the body, then they could have instantly quashed resurrection stories by producing the body. So that leaves the disciples as the grave robbers. But I want to ask you, is that really plausible? The same men who scattered when Jesus was arrested, whose leader swore he didn't know him, they were depressed, they were frightened, they were disillusioned. They were in no state to overcome or to trick an elite troop of Roman guards. And actually, they would have been devoid of any motive to carry out such a plan, because dead messiahs have no followers. Dead generals win no wars. And the Jews and the Romans both wanted an end to this messianic nightmare that they'd been living through. And if they had really believed that the disciples had stolen the body, they'd have rounded them up and they'd have tortured them until they confessed where the body had been hidden and made them produce it. But that never happened. So what changed this bunch of discouraged cowards into men and women who turned the world upside down? Well, we'll return to that shortly. But before then, we need to consider this. The fact that the disciples had experiences of a risen Jesus, which gave rise to the resurrection faith. I want to say this. Although much is made of the effect on the disciples of the empty tomb, that actually misses the point. Because what convinced the disciples was not the empty tomb. When Mary and the other women went and told the 12 minus 1 that Jesus' body had been moved, they said, They've taken his body. They didn't say he's risen from the dead. There were several possible explanations for an empty tomb. Resurrection wasn't on their agenda. So what really convinced the disciples wasn't the empty tomb, but Jesus' appearances. The fact that for 40 days after rising from the dead, they walked with him, talked with him, and ate with him. They came into contact with Jesus personally in the 6 weeks that followed his crucifixion. They didn't expect to. He first came to them after he was resurrected when they were discussing the disappearance of his body. And when he came to them, they were frightened witless, thinking they were seeing a ghost. And let's be honest, it would be just as bewildering for us as it was for them. So their reason for doubt and fear is quite obvious. But they came to believe that they had witnessed something unique as Jesus appeared to them many times, and these experiences profoundly impacted their lives. Those who would attack the Christian faith have often tried to dismiss the appearances as hallucinations. But actually there are 2 problems with this theory. The first one is that it doesn't fit the psychology of hallucinations, and the other is that it doesn't fit the facts. Hallucinations happen to nervous, highly strung, highly imaginative people. They're also linked to the individual subconscious, the individual beliefs, the individual experiences. They usually occur at particularly nostalgia-creating places, and they recur over long periods of time. And not only that, mass hallucinations are deemed to be impossible by modern psychology. So to say that the disciples were hallucinating implies the proposition that this happened to groups of up to 500 people, which is a psychological impossibility. And the hallucination theory also fails to explain one significant fact. It doesn't explain the empty tomb. Had the disciples and many others hallucinated Jesus' appearances, the commotion that they were causing in Jerusalem could have been stopped at any moment by the production of the body. But the movement did start, and the resurrection of Jesus was the grounds on which it began. And that leads us neatly on to our next fact. The fact that the Christian movement began in Jerusalem, not some far-flung corner of empire. And it was based on the belief that Jesus was alive. The disciples became the forerunners of a new movement that swept the world, and Jesus' resurrection from the dead was central to their faith. Peter preached the message in Jerusalem, effectively saying, well, everyone knows where King David's body is, but Jesus' body is missing. And had that not been true, anyone in the audience could have refuted it. The Jews or the Romans could have opened the tomb and paraded the body through the city to show everyone that the disciples' message was false. But they didn't, because there was no body to be produced. And let me underline the fact that this message was preached not in a distant location, but it was in precisely the place where all of the events had happened, which is where the story would have been the easiest to verify or disprove. And it was precisely from that position, from that place, from that location, from Jerusalem, that the church grew. Not only that, the Christian movement grew amazingly quickly. And that's one of the reasons why serious historians do not accept that Jesus and his resurrection was a legend, because legends take many years to accumulate support and gain acceptance, whereas Christianity spread immediately. In fact, the Jewish authorities were in a state of panic because they couldn't contain it. Its growth was so rapid. And bear this in mind, that the previously cowardly disciples now proclaimed the message boldly. And they were persecuted for that. And every single one of the original apostles ultimately gave their lives for their faith. Their preaching always included the declaration that Jesus, the Messiah, rose from the dead. And this is of crucial importance. If this was all a hoax, why would they go to their graves proclaiming that it actually happened? Now listen, I'm not saying that people of other religions or worldviews have not died for a faith that is unfounded. Many have. The crucial difference here is that such people did not know that their faith was unfounded. They believed it to be true. But the disciples would have known that they were spreading a lie if they had stolen the body or made up the story. They would all have died for what they clearly knew to be a hoax. Now, is it even plausible that not even one of them, under the threat of death, would not admit that they'd lied? What they saw changed their lives. They knew they'd seen Jesus rise from the dead. They laid down their lives as the ultimate proof of their complete confidence in the truth of their message. And that brings us to our final piece of historical evidence, the fact of the conversion of Paul. How did Saul of Tarsus, the self-appointed but officially recognized chief persecutor of Christians, convert to become the Apostle Paul, a fearless follower of the way? He was adamantly against Jesus because he believed him to be a false Messiah who had been preaching heresy. And so Saul set out to destroy the church. But in his own words, recorded in the book of Acts, he said that Jesus had appeared to him, and as a result of that, we are left with this historical fact. Something happened to Paul that literally turned his life upside down. And almost overnight, he went from murderer to missionary. The life of Paul, or Saul of Tarsus, is inexplicable if Jesus was not resurrected from the dead. I want to close by correcting a piece of Christian misquotation. You'll often see in books that this quotation that I'm about to give you is ascribed to Lord Chief Justice Darling, who apparently nobody can find any record of. But the quote does exist. Lord Lyndhurst was one of Britain's greatest legal minds and High Steward of the University of Cambridge. When he died, as they were clearing through his papers, they came across a note in his own hand telling why he believed in the resurrection. And he had moved some important legislation through Parliament that was related to religious affairs. And he wrote this: "No intelligent jury in the world could fail to bring in a verdict that the resurrection story is true." And I would agree.
Thank you for listening to Sunrise with Leslie Thomas. Don't forget to subscribe, rate and leave a comment.